Valerie's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the collar of her crisp white shirt, trying to ignore the gnawing pit in her stomach. The restaurant was nearly empty as she prepared for the evening rush, the clink of glass and the hum of the fridge the only sounds filling the air. The shift had started with an argument. Her manager, a wiry man with a permanent frown, barked at her for being late with the dessert plates. "You're going to ruin the service. Valerie, get it together. These people expect the best," he snapped, his breath sour with coffee. The pressure of the upscale clientele, the sharp looks from other staff, and the constant fear of messing up weighed heavily on her. The doors to the restaurant swung open with a whoosh, and the usual chatter of well-dressed patrons drifted in. But one figure immediately caught her attention. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his face set in a cold, almost imperceptible scowl. Victor Langford. Billionaire. The kind of man who seemed to belong to another world. A world where people like her were invisible. She had seen him a few times, but never close up. This time, he sat at a corner booth, his eyes never lifting from his phone. Valerie was the one who had to serve him tonight. Her nerves flared as she balanced the dessert tray, walking slowly toward his table. She had been taught to keep her head down and not to engage too much, to simply serve. As she set down the delicate chocolate dessert in front of him, the light hit her ring a simple, worn band her mother had given her years ago. Without thinking, she murmured, "My mother has that ring." The moment the words left her mouth, everything changed. Victor's fork froze in midair, his eyes snapping to the ring on her finger, his face drained of color, and for a brief second, his hand clutched at his chest. Valerie watched in shock as his body crumpled forward, hitting the table with a loud thud. The whiskey glass beside him tipped over, amber liquid spilling out and pooling like blood across the pristine white tablecloth. The restaurant fell into chaos. Waiters shouted for a doctor. Glass shattered on the floor, and customers stared in confusion. Valerie stood there, frozen, her heart pounding as she stared at Victor, sprawled across the table, unable to move. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had only mentioned the ring, the one her mother wore every day, the one that had always been part of her life. Yet, something about that simple statement had triggered Victor in a way she couldn't understand. The ring, the words, her mother. It all felt like something far bigger than she could grasp. And as she stood there, waiting for the chaos to die down, she realized that her life, too, had just taken a turn that she hadn't seen coming. The restaurant was in utter chaos. The shrill voices of customers, the sound of a broken glass, and the desperate cries for help echoed through the walls. Valerie stood frozen in the middle of it all, her hands still trembling from the shock of what had just happened. She could hardly believe it. Victor Langford, the billionaire, the man who seemed untouchable, had just collapsed at her feet. Her mind raced, but it wasn't long before the manager, Greg, pulled her out of the scene, his hand grabbing her arm roughly. "What did you do?" Greg hissed, his eyes sharp and accusing. Valerie couldn't find her voice. She felt the weight of his stare like it was piercing through her. "What did you put in his food?" he demanded, his breath hot and sour. The panic in her chest was building, but she forced herself to stay calm, not letting it show. "Nothing," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady, though she felt anything but composed. "I just set down the dessert." But Greg wasn't convinced. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You said something to him," he muttered. "What was it?" Valerie didn't answer. She couldn't. The words she'd said to Victor were harmless, weren't they? It had been nothing more than a passing comment about the ring, but she knew, deep down, that this wasn't about the words, it was about who she was and where she came from. She was Just a waitress. A poor girl in a fancy restaurant. She had no place here. Not really. As Greg's accusations hung in the air, Valerie was led to the back, where the rest of the staff was gathered, whispering and casting sideways glances in her direction. They didn't say anything out loud, but the looks were enough. Tara, the girl with the perfect curls and the fake smile, leaned in close as Valerie walked past. "Careful," she sneered. "Those hands of yours are shaking. You're going to drop the next baccarat crystal." A few cooks snickered, but Valerie didn't let their words cut through her. She kept walking, her hands steady, her head down. She'd heard worse growing up. Back in the kitchen, the whispers continued. The workers, the cooks, the waiters, they all knew her. They knew where she came from, even if they never said it aloud. Valerie had been raised in a trailer park, barely scraping by with her mother, Eliza. She had spent her childhood being called trailer trash by kids at school, and those same kids had no idea about her mother's lullabies or how they'd huddle together on cold nights with the only warmth coming from the thin blankets on their beds. They didn't know that Valerie had taught herself to read by flashlight after the power had been cut off. And now, here she was, in this fancy restaurant, her face a mask of calm while the whispers of the other servers stung her like 1,000 needles. The headlines didn't help either. She saw one at the convenience store later that night. Waitress causes billionaire's collapse, with a grainy picture of her standing wide-eyed and still, her apron stained with coffee. The cashier, who had always been kind to her, didn't even look her in the eye as he slid her change across the counter. "You're famous now," he muttered. Barely audible. Valerie didn't say anything. She couldn't. She didn't want to explain herself. She didn't want to tell him the truth that she hadn't done anything wrong. She just wanted to get through the day without being looked at like she didn't belong. Back home, her mother sat at the kitchen table, humming softly as she always did when she was nervous. Valerie could feel the tension of the day in the air. But she didn't tell her mother about the incident. She didn't want to worry her, especially since Eliza's memory had started to fade. Valerie just kissed her mother's forehead and tried to find some sense of normalcy, even though the world outside was anything but. And then, the headlines kept coming. The whispers never stopped. She became the girl who had brought down Victor Langford with just a few words. A girl who had no business being in the world of the rich and powerful. Yet here she was, at the center of it all. But Valerie kept walking, head held high, her face still a mask. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let them break her. Valerie sat nervously in the sterile waiting room of the Langford Group offices, the faint scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. She had never imagined a day like this, being summoned to meet with Victor Langford's legal team after the incident at the restaurant. Her hands were clammy as she fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, the weight of the situation sinking in. She had no idea what to expect. Victor was lying in a private hospital room after collapsing, and she was about to walk into his world. The door to the office opened, and a man in a sharp suit gestured for her to come in. Victor sat in a recliner, looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. His face was pale, and his usual cold demeanor seemed to have melted away, replaced with a look of quiet curiosity. As she stepped into the room, he stared at her intently, his eyes moving to the ring on her finger. "You," Victor said softly, his voice cracking slightly. "Where did you get that ring?" Valerie's breath caught in her throat. The question felt loaded, as if it carried a weight she wasn't ready for. The ring had always been a symbol of her mother's resilience, the one thing that had remained constant in their lives. "It's my mother's," Valerie said quietly, the words slipping out almost automatically. "Her name is Eliza. She doesn't remember much about it, though." Victor's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something deep and unsettling in his gaze. "Eliza," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not possible. Eliza. He cut himself off, his words trailing into silence. He stared at her, as if trying to make sense of something that didn't quite fit. Valerie noticed how his hand subconsciously reached for his chest, his breath quickening. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths. As she stood there, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in her mind. Her mother's memory had been fuzzy for years, but there were fragments of a past that didn't quite add up. Eliza had been in a terrible accident at Bixby Bridge, and after that, her memory had never fully returned. Valerie had grown up hearing her mother hum a lullaby, a song that felt like it belonged to another time, but Eliza had never been able to explain its meaning. Valerie had always felt that there was something important, locked away, something her mother couldn't remember. And now, standing before Victor, she began to suspect that the ring might hold the key to that forgotten truth. Victor's expression grew more intense, his gaze never leaving the ring. "That ring," he said again, his voice steady now, but full of something else, something she couldn't quite place. "It belonged to my wife, Evelyn. She disappeared 20 years ago after the accident." The realization hit Valerie like a physical blow. Evelyn Langford, his wife, the woman who had vanished without a trace, the woman who might just be her mother. She stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Could it really be? Was her mother Evelyn Langford, the woman whose name had been erased from the family history? Had the woman who had once been part of this world been lost forever, only to be forgotten by the very people who should have remembered her? The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as Valerie tried to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that rushed through her. Confusion, disbelief, and a creeping sense of dread tangled together. But there was something else too, something that felt like hope. She had spent her whole life feeling like she didn't belong, like she was different from everyone around her. But now, standing before Victor Langford, she was beginning to understand that the life she had known might not be the whole story. Victor's voice broke through her thoughts. "I need you to understand," he said, his words deliberate and slow. "Your mother is not who you think she is. And if she is Evelyn, then everything changes." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Valerie felt as if she were standing on the edge of something far bigger than herself, something that could shatter the life she had always known. The truth was finally starting to unravel, but it was a truth that felt too big, too dangerous to face. And yet, she knew she had no choice but to face it. Her mother's past, her own identity, and the future she had never imagined were all tied together in a story that was just beginning to unfold. Valerie sat in the dimly lit corner of her apartment, the small jewelry box in front of her now open. Her fingers trembled as she sifted through the contents, memories flooding her mind with each piece she uncovered. She had always known that her mother, Eliza, held on to things with a deep, almost obsessive care. But today, it was a key that caught her attention. It was small, brass, and engraved with a delicate phoenix design. She had seen it before, tucked away in her mother's keepsake box. It was always a mystery to her why had Eliza kept it hidden all these years. Curiosity pushed Valerie further, and she carefully lifted the next item. It was an old, weathered wooden box, smaller than a shoebox, but just as significant. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. Inside, she found faded photographs of her mother and a man she didn't recognize. The man was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that was unmistakable even in the grainy photo. Her eyes quickly moved to the next item, a hospital discharge form. The name on the paper was not Eliza's, but Jane Doe, dated from the time of the accident at Bixby Bridge. Valerie's breath caught in her throat. Jane Doe, that was the name they had given her mother when she was found on the bridge. Unconscious, unable to recall who she was. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The man in the photo wasn't just some stranger. He was Victor Langford. Her mother had been married to him, and somehow that marriage had been erased from history. Her mother had been Evelyn Langford, Victor's wife, lost in a tragic accident and forgotten by everyone except the few who truly knew her. As Valerie processed this, a deep sense of betrayal gnawed at her. Why had her mother never told her the truth, and why had Victor never searched for her? Or worse, never acknowledged her existence. The truth was buried deep, and Valerie was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The following day, the stakes grew higher. At a critical family meeting, Adrian Langford, Victor's cousin, used Valerie as a scapegoat. He stood before the family, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "This girl," he sneered, "is nothing but a fraud. She's been exploiting my cousin's tragedy for her own gain. Don't let her fool you." The room fell silent, all eyes on Valerie. She could feel the weight of the accusations pressing in on her, but she didn't flinch. With a calmness that surprised even herself, Valerie stood tall. "I'm just the truth," she said, her voice steady. "And the truth doesn't need permission." The room shifted, the power of her words hanging in the air like a sharp, biting wind. Adrian's face twisted with anger, but Valerie held her ground. She wasn't going to let him drag her into his web of lies. In the days that followed, Victor and his assistant Elliot dug deeper into Adrian's past. They uncovered a trail of corruption, leading them back to the car accident that had destroyed Eliza's life, and Adrian's involvement in orchestrating it. It turned out that Adrian had manipulated the events of that night, ensuring that Eliza would be lost, not only to the Langford family but also to the world. He had fabricated the entire story to seize control of the family's wealth and legacy. As the truth unraveled, Valerie's sense of justice only grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her mother's memory, for a history that had been stolen. The quiet power of her words in that meeting had marked a turning point, and Valerie knew she was ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't going to let anyone steal the truth. Not anymore. The day of the press conference had arrived, and Valerie stood at the front with her mother, Eliza, by her side. The room was filled with flashing cameras, reporters clamoring to get their questions in. The air felt thick with anticipation, as Valerie's name had become a topic of fierce debate. "How do you respond to the accusations?" Valerie, one reporter called out, his voice sharp. "Is it true that you've been lying about your relationship with Victor Langford?" The questions came fast, each one more pointed than the last, but Valerie stood tall, her eyes never leaving the crowd. She felt the weight of their scrutiny pressing in on her, but she refused to let it break her. She knew this was her moment, her chance to tell the truth, to finally be seen. But before she could speak, Eliza, her mother, began to hum softly. The melody was familiar, one Valerie had heard countless times as a child. It was the lullaby Eliza used to sing to her when the world seemed too big, too confusing. As the soft hum filled the room, something changed. Victor Langford, standing at the back of the room, suddenly stopped in his tracks, his gaze locked on Eliza, and for the first time in years, Valerie saw the man she had only heard about, someone who was lost in his memories, fighting to hold on to a past he had buried. Tears welled in his eyes as he took a step forward. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice trembling, "you're alive." The room went silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The realization hit like a wave. The truth was finally out. DNA tests had confirmed what Valerie had known deep down. Eliza was not just her mother. She was Evelyn Langford, the woman who had disappeared from Victor's life 20 years ago. And now, Valerie had been officially recognized as their daughter. As the truth settled in, the cameras clicked away, capturing the raw emotion in the room. Valerie's heart was heavy with the weight of everything she had learned, but there was also a sense of relief, a feeling of redemption. She had fought for this moment, for her mother's memory, and for the life that had been stolen from them. It was a victory not just for her, but for everything they had endured. After everything had been revealed, Valerie didn't go back to the restaurant. The place that had once been her daily reality was no longer a part of her life. She had earned a place in the Langford family, but that was not what mattered to her. What mattered was the quiet sense of purpose she discovered along the way, instead of seeking attention or recognition. Valerie turned her focus to something more meaningful. She continued to quietly contribute to various charities, giving what she could, helping in ways that wouldn't be seen or celebrated. She didn't need the world to applaud her efforts. The work itself was enough. One afternoon, as she was leaving a volunteer event, a woman who had once mocked her outside the restaurant stopped her. "Are you still chasing fame?" she asked, her tone dripping with judgment. Valerie didn't even flinch. She looked the woman in the eye and answered calmly, "No, I'm just giving back." Her words hung in the air, simple, yet strong. Valerie wasn't interested in fame or the limelight. What mattered was that she had found a way to make a real difference, and that was all the recognition she needed. There was power in her silence, in the quiet victories that didn't demand a stage. Her confidence came from knowing that she was doing the right thing, not for praise, but for herself. Valerie sat quietly next to her mother in the hospital room, the soft beeping of machines the only sound in the otherwise still air. Eliza's hand rested gently in hers, the weight of the phoenix ring a constant reminder of everything that had led them here. The ring, once a symbol of loss and forgotten memories, now stood as a promise, an unspoken vow that the truth would always prevail, no matter how long it took. Valerie's eyes traced the familiar shape of the ring, feeling a deep sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She thought about everything she had been through, the whispers, the judgments, the moments of doubt. And yet, here she was, sitting beside her mother, the woman who had given her life and love, and who now carried a past that had once been erased. They had made it through, not because they had shouted their truth to the world, but because they had quietly, steadily held on to it. For everyone who's been overlooked, judged, or silenced, Valerie whispered softly to herself, the weight of the words heavy but comforting. This story is a quiet victory. The truth doesn't scream. It simply stands. The words felt like a seal on the chapter of their lives, a chapter that was now closed, but not forgotten. As Valerie sat there, feeling the steady rhythm of her mother's breath, she realized that the greatest victories aren't always loud. Sometimes they are the ones that come with silence, with calm, with knowing that the truth has been honored.